All right, this is the last chapter of this unit, and again, just kind of hit the vocab on here. It's just going to be a lot of terms that we're going to use for the last unit when we do diseases. Starting with pathology, which is the study of disease. That's different than etiology, which is a fancier word, I think. It's the study of the cause of the disease. Not like, oh, this is diarrhea, sir. It's like, oh, you got the diarrhea from drinking out of the dirty water well or something. It gives it more of an investigation behind why you got sick. Pathogenesis, again, just the ability of a microbe to develop or generate disease. Infection is always going to specifically be caused by pathogens. Remember, not every microbe is pathogenic. Actually, the minority of them are. And then a disease is kind of like all of the conditions in which the host's body is not doing very well. Keep in mind that we have a lot of microbes on and in a host. Some of those that are normal will come and go. Sometimes they're there permanently as a type of interdependent symbiosis. Symbiosis is a term that we've looked at in other contexts, but it's just basically living together. And we do want to kind of like look narrowly at what is the cost of having this microbial symbiosis and what is the benefit. And I would say a good kind of like clear, like opposite example is like a parasite. That pathogen is getting all the advantage, but the host is harmed. Where if it's mutualistic, they both benefit, like mutually. Those are kind of extremes, like one's bad and one's good. There can also be, I guess, at least on paper, the commensalism relationship, which is where we don't really see that anybody's harmed. Like the host is just like, well, whatever. But then there's benefit for another organism. Sometimes these can change, and I will say there's a bird that they talk about in your textbook called the oxpecker. It's a bird that kind of like lives on the hind end of a hippopotamus or something like that, and it'll peck the bugs off of the animal's back, which is, could be an advantage. I would actually argue, though, that if there's any open wounds on that animal host, the bird can kind of peck at that little sore and make it slower to heal. So, in that example, I think you could argue that it could be very much mutualistic or maybe commensal, depending on like what your situation is, and maybe even a little bit of a parasite. I don't know. Maybe these are just like human constructs and they don't actually matter, but they are terms that you're going to see, and just kind of remember who's getting the benefit and who's getting the cost. Here's some naked people. I just want to say that there's a lot of microbes on your skin. There's a lot of microbes in your GI tract. There's pretty much microbes everywhere we have looked. The exception, I will say, is that there is not a whole lot of microbes in the central nervous system cavities. And we think that in the birth compartments, there is also a very restrictive barrier for basically keeping that baby in development sort of isolated from a normal maternal microbiome. There's questions about that, though, in terms of whether it really is sterile or not. I don't know. We just don't know. But we have more microbes than we thought a few years ago. And we're talking like trillions of bacteria. I mean, there's 4 unique species that live in the juice of the eye. Like, it's just everywhere we look, we're like, oh, I guess there are actually microbes that live there. Can I also just say maybe we're not capable of culturing them? Is it too soon? All right. So, normal microbiota interactions. We know that they're competitive. They need space, they need food, they want all that stuff. And just by having the good guys in position, they will usually compete against the pathogens. And this is so true. Having more diversity is more protective than less diversity. We see more species in the mouth during cavities or maybe even periodontitis where people lose their teeth. We see more diversity in people who are like not experiencing digestive problems. People who get like chronic bowel diseases or even chronic obesity will actually see fewer species inside the GI tract. So the idea here is to give them every available niche space, all of the resources. We want them to be thriving and diverse. Probiotics, I just want to say, I get the idea of probiotics. I really do. Probiotics are basically lab cultures that you can buy from the grocery store and put those in your body and reinvigorate your microbiome. Yeah, it sounds like that's a really good idea, right? Probably it's a mixed bag. I think that you should get your probiotics from food, like real food. When you eat clean, raw, like living food, everything is rebalanced by nature. If you go buy a bunch of pills from, Whole Foods or whatever, you're just getting a few of what should be there. And I don't think it actually pencils out as a benefit. I mean, I don't think they're bad for most people, but we are seeing some troubling studies that it can actually elongate a recovery period back towards your natural equilibrium, particularly in kids. So I would just put it out there. I'm not a fan. I get the idea, I really do. I think you should get your probiotics, but from nature and food and all of those things about eating clean that makes you feel good are basically giving your gut bacteria exactly the nutrients and the recruitment that they need to thrive. I will revisit Koch's postulates. Koch's. I wish I could say that like a German person. He gets kind of tagged as one of the influencers of epidemiology. And he did figure some stuff out. I gotta give him some credit. I read this book about, honestly, it was about the development of the toilet. Really interesting history. Like, whoa, crazy. Anyway, people were getting really poisoned water and there was no like separation of like wastewater and drinking water. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. He figured it out that it was basically this horrible tainted well that was making people sick by using a rigorous series of postulates. Like, oh, okay, I'm going to identify and isolate an organism. I'm going to see if it makes my test rats or mice or whatever he used sick, and then I'm going to re-isolate that pathogen and make sure it's the same as what I found in nature. And we do use like a looser version of these postulates, but I will say you do kind of still have to understand the etiology of a disease, and I'll totally give him props for that. I also want to remind you that not all germs cause disease. Like, this whole epidemiology thing is like, oh, germs, bad, bad, bad. And we kind of went on this rampage against microbes for decades. We have a very different understanding of susceptibility now because you don't get sick when you're healthy. You get sick when you're tired and weakened, and I don't know, there's something that just allows your body to crumble. Like, I always get sick during finals week. But that's different. It's not a germ. It's like a normal thing that you would be capable of dealing with. It's just your body is incapable of being resistant to it when it's weakened. More words. A symptom is experienced by a patient. Oh, I feel bad. I have a stomach ache. I have a headache. You can't really measure that stuff. You kind of have to ask the right questions to get the symptoms. A sign is something you should be able to observe. Oh, I see you have a 1 centimeter watery, blistery rash all over your torso. I see you have a fever of 103. You have something I can, as a practitioner, measure or observe. Those are signs. So you see signs, they feel symptoms. Syndromes are where we put this all together, the signs and the symptoms, and sometimes, you kind of have to think from their perspective and your perspective to get it right. We like to focus on communicable or contagious diseases because they're the best ones, honestly. But there are other diseases out there, non-communicable diseases, things like cancer, I guess would be a good example. Incidence and prevalence. These are two super important words. Incidence is the number of new cases. Like, let's say we're looking right now at a pandemic where we are looking at the incidence every day. Like, we want to know how many new cases there are every single day. Usually we go over a longer period of time. Like, I'm not going to lie. This is crazy town. Prevalence is all the cases. So a lot of these like tracking websites for COVID that I kind of check out because I'm still trying to learn as much as I can about this virus is, okay, this many new cases, but now the total of the world is 2 million, 2.5 million, 3 million. Like, that's prevalence. That's all the cases, and that includes people who have recovered. Sporadic diseases are things that just kind of come and go, like just like boop, oh hi Ebola, and then it's gone. Endemic is like within a population. These terms, epidemic and pandemic, they might sound kind of familiar to you, like they're the same thing, but pandemic is the better word now because of the ease at which we can move around the world. So it takes like 24 hours and you can pretty much be anywhere else on the planet. I mean, as soon as we're going places again. But epidemic is a word that we've largely replaced with the word pandemic because there aren't really any borders anymore. Herd immunity, you might have heard me mention. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Herd immunity is just like some people have natural immunity, period. Like there's no disease in history that has killed 100% of the population. Some have been real close, but there's like, yep, some magical thing that some person has in their immune system and they're okay. Usually the herd immunity to resist diseases needs to be in the high 90s. So the 95% and above, that means so many people are like immune that like everyone's protected because the disease won't circulate. That's kind of a concept we'll see in a few examples later. Acute diseases, symptoms develop rapidly. Depends on the microbe. It could be 24 hours, like for stomach flu. It could be 21 days for things like measles. So just kind of all over the map. Chronic disease, like cancer, slow grow. We get latent diseases. I'm going to skip down to the bottom because that one's familiar. Latent disease, you'll have a period of no symptoms. But it's actually like not developing, like it's a pause. So you get like an outbreak of cold sores and then nothing, and then cold sore and then nothing. That's latent. Subacute is kind of easily confused, I think, with latent disease, but it's like instead of years to develop, it takes maybe months. So anyway, it's not black and white. We have gray areas for pretty much everything. In terms of the extent of an infection, we'll have a small area which is localized or a local infection. If it's systemic, that implies that it's in all of the body's systems. That usually requires transport through body fluids like blood or lymph. That is super serious. A focal infection is one that starts local and then gets systemic. It is true that most of these infections will start as local infections, and that's when they're the easiest to deal with. But if they don't get treated, or people just try to not go to the doctor or whatever, treat it with like tea tree oil or whatever, it can become more serious. So you kind of want to know where it started and then make the call as to whether it's a focal infection or not. Bacteremia is bacteria in the blood. Septicemia is a little different. It is bacteria that are replicating exponentially in the blood. So remember, there can be times when it's not growing. There are lots of chemicals in the blood that can inhibit microbial growth. So septicemia is really bad. And then, of course, we have toxins. We have exo and endotoxins to contend with. And if the presence of toxins is noted, that would be toxemia. Primary infection and secondary infection, we have your original problem and then a second problem that may occur. So a classic example of this is where, let's say you have a patient who wants to take antibiotics for strep throat, which is completely appropriate. So those antibiotics are not just going to influence the strep in the throat, it's going to attack strep all over the place. And one of the side effects of that type of antibiotic therapy in women is a displacement of the vaginal flora. So without the bacteria, and these bacteria are interestingly acid producers, which reduces the pH or acidifies the pH of the vagina to between 5 and 6. That pH is what keeps yeast from growing inside that tissue. If that bacteria is harmed, then it becomes more neutral, and then yeast infections are a classic secondary infection. It's not that it was there before, it was that this treatment of the primary infection has allowed an opportunistic infection to occur. And I always hate that, like that it shouldn't be a surprise. You got to kind of think in sequence here. Microbes are sensitive. You can never just target like one specific thing and not, I think, identify a potential chain reaction. Subclinical good diseases, these are scary, scary, scary. Someone doesn't have signs or symptoms they don't know, which means they can be transmitting that disease without any real I mean, I don't even hold them responsible. Like, how are you supposed to know if you don't feel anything? This can be a real problem, particularly with sexually transmitted infections that are completely asymptomatic. Predisposing factors. We'll always go through the anatomy first because there's going to be something susceptible, some little pore or maybe some surface. Genetics, I don't know, everything's about genetics these days, but yeah, there's people who actually have a genetic predisposition or even a resistance to certain things. Climate and weather, we do see seasonality sometimes. It just depends on the microbe. And like I said, fatigue, age, lifestyle, are you getting enough sleep? Are you on drugs? Are you taking chemicals for any other type of medical disorder? And honestly, stress. I think we should have a whole class just about how stress messes you up. Like, I don't know. I'm experiencing stress. Are you stressed? I feel really stressed. Anyway, you got to look at the predisposing factors because those sometimes need to be addressed before you can successfully treat a disease. Reservoirs of infection, we'll see pretty much anything you're ever going to come into contact. People, animals, dirt. That's it. That's the whole world. So you can go and like live in the woods or whatever, and you're still going to have reservoirs of infections. A lot of times, transmitting diseases requires a certain type of contact. Direct is basically like, being in the room together, breathing each other's air, like touching each other's skin. That's pretty direct. Indirect usually can be described as spreading through a non-living or inanimate object. In medicine and surgery, we refer to inanimate objects as fomites. Super good vocabulary word if you're going into surgical technology, because pretty much anything like instrumentation wise that you learn about in surgery is a fomite. It is something that can transmit indirectly diseases. And, when you look at the heart of a hospital, it's not surgery, it's not the lab, it's sterile processing. I mean, people don't understand. Like, it is so logistically complicated. How many instruments are for what procedure and where and how it needs to go. And this handle is for this. And there's so many different types of scissors. Like, oh my gosh, you guys, that's crazy. Anyway, the heart of any hospital is the processing of fomites. And it's sterile processing is so vital, and everybody just takes it for granted. Anyway, also droplets. And droplets are kind of interesting. They're just like little wet balls of disease. Anything that you don't want to touch in the world is usually a fomite. I just think it's interesting about doorknobs. Can I just say, because they're metal, these have got some antimicrobial properties just built into them structurally, which I think is kind of cool. But you should always like use a paper towel or something after you wash your hands. In terms of droplets, you give yourself maybe 4, 5, 6 feet diameter. There's some real gross stuff in people's sneezes and coughs and stuff. Probably best to avoid. I don't know, you guys think we're going to stop handshaking after this whole stuff that we're going through? I kind of wonder. I was thinking about it. I haven't really been around people in a really long time, but I kind of don't want to shake hands anymore. Like, I've not wanted to for a long time just because I teach this class, but it was so weird. I was meeting with someone on campus before we had a stay-at-home policy, and I didn't handshake because she was. I mean, it was kind of right as it was getting going, and she's like pregnant, and I don't know, all this stuff. And I like put my hand over my heart and I bowed, and I felt so lame. Anyway, I don't know what else to do because like everything feels really lame, but I've wanted handshaking to stop forever. More vocab. Vehicle. Transmission by food or water. Think of salad bar. There's also going to be the vector review that we talked about already, mechanical and biological vectors. So keep in mind, you can get it from a salad bar if it's a vehicle, or you can get it from a living inoculation, and it just matters if it's part of that pathogen's life cycle. All right, nosocomial infections are, again, hospital acquired. And just remember, hospitals, we warehouse all of our sick people together. We do invasive procedures on them, and we have to take care of multiple people, which is a chain of transmission, which makes these incredibly, I think, perfect for causing disease. Nobody's collecting data right now on anything, but prior to this whole COVID situation where people still have elective procedures happening, this is kind of latest data. Pneumonia is usually from just The abuse of a ventilator blowing air into your lungs, and it causes inflammation. I don't care how good you are at calibrating a ventilator, it's still a pressure hose of air like forcing its way into your lungs is going to cause like little microscopic inflammations, and that fluid that results from inflammation can be a reservoir for microbe. We always do a chest x-ray when someone is extubated to screen for pneumonia. I don't think we can do much about that. What we can maybe make like an inroad here is with better surgical site infections, like not like getting microbes into a surgical wound or instrumentation. I don't know. These are these are disturbing. These nosocomial infections can kill you. And I think we just have to do better with education and preparation so that when we have to do procedures on people, they're not going to collect an infection from having been in that institution. For reporting purposes, this does vary by region. In the Pacific Northwest, we're still seeing predominantly gram-positive staphylococci, so like things like MRSA. But we're starting to see some other like upticks in the gram-negative stuff, which is kind of scary. The gram-negative bacteria tend to be more toxogenic and be harder to treat with antibiotics. So if you've never heard of C. diff, I'll mention this one first because C. diff is really bad. You should associate this with antibiotic abuse. You, as a healthy person, should not worry about this diarrhea illness. It is for people who've had displacement of their normal gut bacteria, and there's toxins that this microbe produces. One toxin strips the surface of your intestines raw, and then the second toxin causes ulcers. Those ulcers can eat through your gut and cause necrotic tissue, and that can be life-threatening, like if you don't remove it. So one of the cool things about C. diff is we can actually, I'm going to use the word cure here, we can cure it with fecal transplants, which is basically an argument that this is about diversity and the happy bacteria being present. It's just too much antibiotics in people's worlds. Other stuff that's pretty scary, we've got C. diff, we've got some CREs, we've got some Klebsiella pneumoniae. The things that are kind of coming are worse than MRSA. These tend to be highly resistant and very lethal in medically like fragile populations, like people who are in residential care homes. So I think maybe the trick is going to be to wean ourselves off so much constant antibiotic therapy. And it is true that these people might need antibiotics, but if we reserve them for the right reasons, then people wouldn't be getting so many persistent, like nasty GI tract problems. Klebsiella pneumoniae is one that is featured in your video for your second reflection paper. This one's pretty nasty. This one can basically be normally found in certain places, but if it gets to the wrong areas, it can definitely be septicemic and cause all sorts of problems. We think that the key for this one is about transmission. It's actually about hand washing. It's not necessarily something that like antibiotic, patients would be experiencing an uptick in K pneumoniae. It does have a really strong capsule that can give it some resistance to drugs, but hand washing of healthcare workers, I think, is the way to keep these out of the nosocomial sphere. Other things to just look out, contributing factors, we already know they can mutate. They're designed to change. There's some practices maybe we could do better, like use less chemicals and crap in our world, just like be more responsible and like let the earth kind of not have so much stress from our patterns of growing crops and animals. Changes in weather, you should know that we're definitely watching and predicting certain diseases to move north as the weather and the waters warm. Don't be surprised if we're starting to see dengue, yellow fever make a comeback in the United States. Modern transportation, I think that is a big key for how things can move. Ecological disaster, I don't know, we're making it hard for these animals and plants to survive. And if, we're moving into their spaces, we're going to be encountering their diseases for the first time. And that can be pretty epic, as you know. Animal control measures, we do a good job in the United States. Like, you get like some infestation of something and there's somebody who will come help you. But our public health system is fragile and it could fail. So I think all of these things are good to consider in terms of why we still continue to see lots of infectious diseases emerge.